Mr. Kara-Murza, thank you for the time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now, as you and I are conducting this interview, of course, Ukraine has been handed over this peace deal from Russia and the United States, and we don't know if it's going to be accepted. We don't know if it sets the parameters for any other future deal, but based on this piece of paper alone, I'm wondering if that is any cause for hope that the war may come to an end, or a cause for concern given the terms outlined in this agreement.
Well, when I look at this so-called peace plan, it looks more like Vladimir Putin's Christmas wish list, frankly, because I don't see a single concession that is demanded of the Kremlin, which, let's not forget, is the aggressor side here. Ukraine did nothing to provoke this aggression, and all the concessions have to come from Ukraine, including ceding territory that Vladimir Putin's regime has not been able to seize militarily for 11 years, since 2014, including the guarantee that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO forever. That's the language I've seen in some of these points. Well, first of all, apart from the fact that that actually directly violates the Washington Treaty, which states that any European country has a right to be a part of NATO. So I don't even see how technically this can be approved. Other than that, though, I have to say I really smiled when I read that word forever in those proposals. I'm a historian by education. A lot of things were supposed to be forever. The Soviet Union was supposed to be forever. In fact, in the Soviet national anthem, there were these words that the Soviet Union was created forever. And then it collapsed in 3 days in 1991. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous, when these dictatorial regimes think that they own eternity, frankly speaking, because this is what it looks like. I have absolutely no doubt that in a very foreseeable future, in the lifetime of all of us, the present generation, both Ukraine and a democratic Russia will actually be members of NATO. And we will finally have that peace and security in Europe we all want to see. But there will not be peace and security in Europe for as long as Vladimir Putin's regime remains in power. Putin's been in power for 25 years, almost 26 next month. And for all this time, he has shown who he is. He has been repressing our own people inside of Russia, murdering his political opponents like Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, imprisoning thousands upon thousands of our own Russian citizens simply for speaking the truth and for opposing this regime. And he has been constantly violating the sovereignty and the borders of other countries and getting involved in all these wars beyond Russian territory, in the Republic of Georgia, in Syria, in Ukraine in 2014, in Ukraine again since 2022. We know who Vladimir Putin is. This is not an enigma. There's nothing new about this. And so for as long as Putin remains in the Kremlin, this war will not stop.
Well, let me get in on that because that is the concern, that this peace plan is not really for a lasting peace, but a chance for Russia to regroup and in the future try to grab more territory from Ukraine. What do you say to that?
We know very clearly from the history of the 20th century that appeasing an aggressor never leads to actual peace. It only leads to more war, more conflict, more suffering, more pain, more blood. I think a lot of people will remember those famous images, or perhaps I should say infamous images, of Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, waving that piece of paper after he came back from the Munich conference in 1938, when the leaders of Western democracies decided to just give away a chunk of Czechoslovakia to Adolf Hitler on the promise that he will not invade again. Well, how did that one work out? Right? It was less than 10 months left until the launch of the Second World War. Appeasing an aggressor never leads to peace. It only whets the aggressor's appetites. Aggressors do not stop on their own. They can only be stopped. And the only language aggressors like Putin, thugs like Putin, bullies like Putin understand is the language of strength and principle. And this is not what we're seeing in this Trump ultimatum.
Well, we've heard President Zelensky, and again, we don't know what's going to happen with this current peace pact, but it does set a precedent going forward. And based on this precedent, President Zelensky says Ukraine has a difficult choice. Either lose dignity by accepting a deal like this, or losing a key ally in the United States. Can Ukraine afford to say no to these types of peace pacts and potentially alienate the White House?
And again, I'm reminded of the 1930s when, Winston Churchill, after the shameful Munich Agreement was concluded, sort of the epitome of the policy of appeasement, Churchill wrote that the British government and French government had choice between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor, and they will have war. And this is exactly what happened, of course. It certainly is not for me to sort of offer any advice to Ukrainian government, Ukrainian society. They will work it out themselves. Ukraine is a democratic country. They have a vibrant civil society. It is for them and only for them to make those decisions. I can only speak as a Russian opposition politician and again as a historian by education, that I do not think that giving in to an aggressor, rewarding an unlawful, murderous aggression, could ever lead to anything positive. And one other important aspect of this so-called peace plan that to me is absolutely unacceptable is the proposed blanket amnesty for all the war crimes that have been committed during this conflict. This is completely unacceptable. Justice is an essential element of any post-war reconstruction. Justice is an essential element of a future reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine. Transitional justice is an indispensable component of any successful transition after traumas like war or totalitarian regimes. And every single one of those war criminals who have committed all these horrendous crimes over these past almost 4 years, each and every one of them will have to be held to account. And this is, by the way, important not just for Ukrainians, it's important for Russians too. Because Russia will not have a normal democratic future after the Putin regime unless we go through this process of a full reckoning and full accountability for all the crimes that have been committed. And let me remind you also that from the summer of this year, from the summer of 2025, the Council of Europe, in cooperation with the government of Ukraine, has established the Special International Tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. It will be based in The Hague, that has the support of dozens of countries, unfortunately not the United States under Donald Trump, but dozens of countries, most of European countries. And the work of this tribunal is already underway, gathering all the documentary evidence, speaking to witnesses, collecting documents and so on in preparation for the day when all the war criminals who are responsible for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, up to and including Vladimir Putin, will be held accountable according to the law for all the crimes they have committed.
Okay, and forgive me for jumping in, but clearly you have a concern here that if there is no criminal prosecution for past wrongs, that will only what? Embolden Vladimir Putin to be harsher against the Russian people?
Absolutely. Putin cannot stop. His regime depends on war and repression. The main instrument of Putin's power, the main instrument of Putin's regime maintaining its power, is fear. You know, they have to make their own people afraid, our own people in Russia afraid. This has been the overwhelming tool that this regime has maintained its control. You know, we haven't had free election in Russia in 25 years. Even the smallest act of protest or even truth-telling lands you in prison for many years. You know, we have a record number of political prisoners in Russia today, not just in the post-Soviet era, but even in the late Soviet era. There are more political prisoners in Russia alone in the year 2025 than there were in the whole of the Soviet Union, which is 15 different countries put together in the mid-1980s. This is how bad the repression is. And this is the only way Putin is able to keep his power. And war is the other side of that, right? When we look at the history of Russia, we will see a very clear pattern that internal repression and external aggression are always two sides of the same coin, right? Because a government that does not respect the rights and freedoms of its own people will not respect the borders of other countries, will not respect the norms of international law. And for as long as Putin remains in power, there will be repression, there will be war. The only way to really guarantee peace and security for Ukraine, the only way to really guarantee peace and security for the whole of Europe is through political change in Russia. Only when there is a peaceful, legitimate, democratic government in Russia, only then will there be real peace and security on the European continent.
So what would you like to see then from the NATO allies like Canada?
I think it is very important that democratic nations, including Canada, which, as you know, has led for decades on questions of principle and human rights and democracy. I mean, Canada was one of the founders of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Canada was one of the original signatories to the Helsinki Final Act 50 years ago this year, which established a clear and inviolable link between security, economic development, and respect for human rights. Canada is a member of such organizations as the G7 or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Canada has a very important voice on the international stage. And given what is happening in the United States right now, given the shameful policy of appeasement of dictators that is conducted by the current American administration, it is all the more important that democratic nations like Canada that still believe that there should be room for principle and values in international affairs speak out in support of Ukraine and in support of the democratic aspirations of the people of Russia. Because at the end of the day, only political change in Russia, only democratic change in Russia will bring that peace and security in Europe that we all want to see.
Mr. Kara-Murza, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you for having me.